Mom, everything is already settled, my son said as I stood in my own driveway holding a suitcase, staring at a moving truck parked in front of the house I had lived in for 37 years. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood there beneath the warm July sun, trying to understand why strangers were carrying boxes across my front lawn. My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 69 years old, a widow, a retired elementary school teacher, and until that afternoon, I believed I knew exactly where I belonged in this world. I had spent the previous 10 days visiting an old friend in Sedona, Arizona. It was the first real trip I had taken since my husband Harold passed away 3 years earlier. My friend Diane had insisted I get away for a while. She said I needed sunshine, fresh air, and a reminder that life still existed beyond grief. For the first time in years, I listened. The trip had been peaceful. We drank coffee on her patio every morning, watched the desert sunrise, and shared stories about our children and grandchildren. I remember feeling lighter than I had in a long time. On the flight home, I even caught myself smiling while looking through old photographs on my phone. I thought about sleeping in my own bed again. I thought about watering the roses Harold planted beside the porch. I thought about returning to the familiar comfort of home. That feeling lasted until I turned onto Maplewood Drive and saw the truck. At first, I assumed one of the neighbors was moving. Then I noticed the vehicle was parked directly in front of my house. My stomach tightened. The driveway was crowded with unfamiliar cars. Several men in matching uniforms were carrying furniture through the front door. For a moment, I wondered if I had the wrong address. But there it was. The white shutters. The blue front door Harold painted himself. The porch swing where we spent summer evenings drinking lemonade. It was my house. I parked at the curb and stepped out slowly. The air felt strangely heavy. One of the movers walked past me carrying a lamp I immediately recognized. Harold had bought it for our 25th wedding anniversary. "Excuse me," I called. "What exactly is going on?" "Here." The man looked uncomfortable. "You'll need to speak with the owner, ma'am." The owner. The word landed like a stone in my chest. Before I could respond, I noticed an envelope taped to the front door. My name was written across it in black marker. Margaret. Nothing else. No explanation. No greeting. Just my name. My hands trembled as I pulled the envelope free. Inside was a single sheet of paper. For words. "Everything is already settled." I read the sentence 3 times. It made no sense. Settled? What was settled? Who had settled it? My heart began to pound. That was when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mom." I turned and saw my son Ethan walking down the driveway. His hands were buried in his pockets. He wouldn't look directly at me. Ethan was 41 years old. The little boy who used to run into my arms after school. The young man Harold and I had worked overtime to put through college. The son I trusted more than anyone. "What is this?" I asked quietly. He glanced at the moving truck and sighed. "Mom, everything is already settled." The exact same words from the letter. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Why are there movers at my house?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "We thought it was time for a change." "We." Not I. "We." I already knew who the second voice belonged to. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. Somewhere inside the house, hidden behind walls that suddenly felt unfamiliar, she was waiting, watching, planning. I looked past Ethan toward the open front door. Another mover emerged carrying a box labeled family photos. My family photos. And for the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt something colder than grief settle deep inside me. I realized this hadn't happened today. It hadn't happened yesterday. Whatever was unfolding in front of me had been planned long before I boarded that plane to Arizona. And somehow, while I was away, my own home had become the center of a secret I knew nothing about. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The movers continued carrying boxes through the front door as if I were invisible. One of them passed by holding a framed photograph of Harold and me from our 30th wedding anniversary. I watched him load it into the back of the truck without even asking where it belonged. Ethan shifted his weight uneasily. He still would not look directly at me. That bothered me more than anything. If he truly believed he was doing the right thing, why could he not meet my eyes? A change for who? I finally asked. My voice sounded calm, but inside I felt strangely hollow. Ethan exhaled. "Mom, you have been alone here for years. This house is too big. It is too much responsibility." I glanced at the porch. Every board of that porch had been repaired by Harold with his own hands. Every flower bed had a story attached to it. "That was not your decision to make." I said quietly. Before Ethan could answer, Vanessa stepped through the doorway. She wore a soft beige sweater and an expression that looked carefully rehearsed. Her smile appeared for only a second before disappearing. "Margaret," she said, "we were hoping you would understand." Understand. The word felt almost insulting. Understand what? I asked. Vanessa folded her arms. That everyone is trying to do what is best for you. I looked from her to Ethan. The same explanation. The same prepared language. It sounded less like concern and more like a script. "Where exactly am I supposed to live?" I asked. Vanessa immediately answered. "We reserved a beautiful extended stay suite for you. It is very comfortable, fully furnished, close to restaurants and shopping." I stared at her. They had arranged housing for me. They had planned every detail. They had expected me to arrive, accept everything, and quietly disappear. My suitcase still sat beside me near the curb. 10 days earlier, I had left believing I had a home waiting for me. Now my own family was speaking as though my life could be packed into a temporary room with a microwave and a television. A breeze moved through the yard. I noticed that several of my rose bushes had already been removed. Fresh dirt covered parts of the garden. Harold had planted those roses the summer Ethan turned 12. I suddenly remembered helping Harold water them after dinner while Ethan rode his bicycle up and down the street. The memory felt painfully close. "When did this start?" I asked. Ethan looked down. Vanessa answered instead. "We have been discussing it for a while." "How long is a while?" Neither of them spoke immediately. That silence told me more than any answer could. Months. Maybe longer. I slowly walked toward the house. Vanessa stepped aside, but I noticed her watching me carefully. The living room looked unfamiliar. Several shelves were empty. Decorative pieces Harold and I had collected during road trips were gone. The grandfather clock that stood beside the fireplace had vanished completely. Even the curtains were different. The room felt staged, as if someone had already begun transforming it into another family's home. My home. I climbed the stairs without asking permission. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa stopped me. At the top of the hallway, I turned toward my bedroom and froze. The door stood open. The room was almost empty. The quilt Harold's mother made decades ago was gone. The photographs on the dresser were gone. The books on my nightstand had disappeared. Only a few cardboard boxes remained near the closet. One was labeled "Donate." I stood there staring at that word. Donate. 37 years of memories reduced to inventory categories. Keep. Store. Donate. Throw away. Somewhere downstairs I heard Vanessa speaking softly to a mover. Ethan replied in a low voice. Their conversation blurred into background noise. I sat slowly on the edge of the bare bed frame and looked around the room. For the first time, I understood something important. This was not a sudden decision. This was not concern. This was a plan. And whatever the real reason was, neither of them had told me the truth. I remained in that room for several minutes after the sounds downstairs faded. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful. Not comforting. It felt deliberate, as though every missing photograph and every empty shelf had been arranged to send a message. Eventually I stood and opened the closet. Most of my clothes were gone. A few jackets remained on hangers, along with several empty garment bags. On the floor sat 2 cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape. One was labeled "Personal Items." The other was labeled "Storage." I stared at the handwriting. It belonged to Vanessa. I would have recognized it anywhere. Neat. Precise. Organized. Years ago, I used to admire that about her. I thought it meant she was responsible, thoughtful, practical. Standing there, I suddenly remembered dozens of small moments I had ignored. Little things that had seemed harmless at the time. A question about property taxes during Thanksgiving dinner. A casual comment about how large the house felt for one person. A suggestion that I should travel more because I deserved to enjoy life. Back then I thought they were being considerate. Now those memories felt different. Like puzzle pieces turning over one by one. I walked downstairs carrying the box marked "Personal Items." Ethan was standing near the kitchen island while Vanessa reviewed something on her phone. Both looked up when they saw me. Neither appeared surprised. Almost as if they had expected exactly how long I would stay upstairs. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Vanessa answered first. "We wanted to wait until everything was ready." "Everything," I repeated. "What exactly does that include?" She exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. Another one of those silent conversations. I had noticed them for years. The transition, she finally said. We wanted it to be smooth. I looked around the kitchen. Harold and I remodeled it 15 years ago. We spent months choosing cabinets and countertops. I remembered arguing over paint colors and laughing when we accidentally ordered the wrong sink. Every corner held a memory. Yet somehow they spoke about my life as if it were a business project. A transition. A process. A logistical problem. Did either of you think to ask me what I wanted? Neither answered. The silence stretched between us. Outside, another truck door slammed shut. I glanced through the window and noticed several pieces of patio furniture already loaded inside. The chairs Harold built by hand. The small table where we drank coffee every Sunday morning. Gone. Vanessa stepped forward and softened her voice. Margaret, we know this is emotional. Emotional. That word almost made me laugh. Emotional suggested confusion, temporary discomfort. What I felt was something else entirely. A realization. Slowly, quietly, pieces of the last year began fitting together. Ethan calling more often to ask about household expenses. Vanessa offering to help organize financial documents. The repeated conversations about retirement communities. The brochures that appeared in my mailbox. Even my Arizona trip suddenly looked different. Diane had invited me months ago, but now I remembered who encouraged me to finally accept. Vanessa. She booked the flight. She helped arrange transportation. She insisted I needed a break. A cold feeling settled into my chest. How long ago did you start planning this? I asked. Ethan looked away. Vanessa folded her arms. That is not really important now. Her answer told me everything. If the truth would help them, they would have shared it immediately. The fact that they would not meant the timeline mattered. A lot. I nodded slowly and set the box on the counter. Then I noticed something near the refrigerator. A stack of folders. Legal folders. One corner of a document was visible. I could not read most of it from where I stood, but I saw enough to recognize my own address printed across the page. And in that moment, I became certain of one thing. The moving truck was only part of the story. The real secret was hidden somewhere inside those papers. My eyes remained fixed on the folders even after Vanessa slid them slightly farther across the counter. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but I noticed it. Years of teaching children had taught me something valuable. People often revealed the truth through the things they tried to hide. I pretended not to notice. Instead, I picked up the box labeled personal items and carried it toward the dining room table. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa followed me immediately. They seemed relieved that I was not arguing. Perhaps they expected tears. Perhaps they expected anger. What they did not expect was silence. Silence makes people comfortable. It encourages them to believe they are safe. I set the box down and slowly opened it. Inside were random pieces of my life. A photo album. A jewelry box. Several framed pictures. An old recipe book covered with handwritten notes. I carefully lifted the recipe book into my lap. Harold had loved Sunday breakfasts. Every week, he would sit at the kitchen counter drinking coffee while I made pancakes from the same recipe written inside those pages. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Not because I was imagining things, but because some memories never truly leave. They wait quietly until you need them. I opened the cover and a folded piece of paper slipped onto the table. My breath caught. Harold's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The note was years old, probably tucked there and forgotten long ago. It was only a grocery list. Milk, eggs, coffee filters. Yet seeing his handwriting stirred something inside me. I remembered a conversation we had shortly before his illness. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Harold had been unusually serious that evening. Promise me something, Maggie, he had said. If anyone ever pressures you about paperwork, property, or money, do not sign a thing until you speak with Richard. Richard Collins had been our attorney for nearly 20 years. At the time I laughed and told Harold he worried too much. He smiled but did not laugh. Just promise me. I had promised. Sitting at the dining room table now, I suddenly remembered every detail of that conversation. The smell of fresh-cut grass. The sound of birds settling into the trees. The look on Harold's face. At the time I thought he was simply being cautious. Now I wondered if he had seen something I missed. Footsteps approached. Ethan entered the room carrying a glass of water. He placed it beside me without speaking. For a brief second, I saw the little boy he used to be. The child who brought me flowers picked from neighbors' gardens and proudly presented them as gifts. The memory hurt more than I expected. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I looked at him. Really looked at him. dark circles beneath his eyes, tension in his shoulders. He did not seem happy. He seemed exhausted. Are you? I asked. His expression tightened. Before he could answer, Vanessa appeared in the doorway. The hotel reservation is confirmed, she announced. You can check in whenever you are ready. Ethan immediately looked away. Another silence followed. Another unanswered question. That was when I noticed something else. A corner of one folder was sticking out from beneath Vanessa's arm. Across the tab, in large printed letters, were two words. Property transfer. My pulse quickened. Vanessa saw where I was looking and quickly adjusted the folder against her side. Too quickly. The reaction lasted less than a second, but it confirmed everything. Whatever was happening was not simply about where I lived. It was about ownership, about control, about something buried inside those documents. I lowered my eyes before either of them could realize what I had seen. Then I picked up Harold's old recipe book and gently closed it. For the first time since arriving home, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Before I trusted another word from either of them, I needed to speak with Richard Collins. That evening I checked into the extended stay hotel exactly as Vanessa had planned. The room was clean, quiet, and completely impersonal. Beige walls, generic artwork, furniture that looked as though it had been selected by someone trying not to offend anyone. I placed my suitcase beside the bed and sat near the window overlooking the parking lot. A few families were unloading luggage from their cars. A delivery driver crossed the lot carrying bags of takeout food. Life continued normally for everyone else. Mine felt suspended somewhere between the past and an uncertain future. I opened my phone and scrolled through old photographs. Harold smiling beside a fishing boat. Ethan on his first day of kindergarten. Christmas mornings. Birthday cakes. Family vacations. Looking at those pictures, I searched for the moment everything had changed. I could not find it. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It grows quietly inside ordinary days until one morning you wake up and realize the life you trusted no longer exists. The next morning I woke before sunrise. For several minutes I stared at the ceiling, remembering Harold's warning. Do not sign anything. Speak with Richard. The memory felt less like advice now, and more like instructions. I showered, dressed, and drove directly to Richard Collins's office downtown. The building looked exactly as I remembered. 3 stories of red brick with neatly trimmed hedges along the sidewalk. Harold and I had walked through those doors dozens of times over the years. Estate planning, tax questions, property documents, ordinary responsibilities of adulthood. I had not visited since Harold's funeral. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Her expression softened when she saw me. Mrs. Dawson, she said warmly. It has been a long time. I smiled politely. Is Richard available? A few minutes later, I was sitting in his office. Richard Collins looked older than I remembered. More gray hair, thicker glasses, but his eyes remained sharp. After a brief greeting, he leaned back in his chair and studied my face. Something is wrong, he said. It was not a question. I told him everything. The moving truck, the boxes, the hotel, the folders, the words property transfer. Richard listened without interrupting. As the story unfolded, his expression grew increasingly serious. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments. Then he opened a drawer and removed a thick file. My name was printed across the front. Before I say anything else, he said carefully, I need to ask one question. Have you signed any documents recently? No. Any powers of attorney? Property authorizations? Ownership transfers? No. He nodded slowly. Good. The single word carried more weight than I expected. My pulse quickened. Richard opened the file and reviewed several pages. Margaret, your husband updated a number of documents during the last year of his life. I sat forward slightly. Harold had never mentioned that. Richard continued reading. He was very thorough. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear. Not relief. Something in between. Why are you looking at me like that? I asked quietly. Richard removed his glasses and folded them carefully on his desk. Because Harold was concerned about something. The room suddenly felt smaller. Concerned about what? Richard hesitated. He never accused anyone of wrongdoing. But he worried that, after his death, people might pressure you regarding the house. I stared at him. The exact thing happening now. Richard opened another section of the file. There is information here you need to see. But before we discuss it, I want copies made of everything. As he stood and gathered documents, I noticed a date printed across one of the pages. The paperwork had been updated nearly 2 years before Harold passed away. 2 years. Long before any of us imagined he would be gone. Long before the moving truck. Long before the hotel room. And suddenly, I could not stop wondering whether Harold had seen danger approaching long before I ever did. Richard returned carrying a thick stack of copies and placed them neatly on the desk between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Sunlight filtered through the office window, illuminating tiny dust particles drifting through the air. Everything looked ordinary. Yet I had this strange feeling that my life was about to divide into two parts. Before this conversation and after it, Richard sat down and opened the file again. "Margaret, I want you to read something." He slid a document across the desk. The heading identified it as an amendment to Harold's estate plan. I scanned the page slowly. Legal language filled most of the document, but several sections had been highlighted. Richard pointed to one paragraph. "Read that part carefully." I adjusted my glasses and read it twice. Then a third time. The meaning gradually became clear. The house had been placed into a trust. Not partially. Completely. Ownership protections had been established years earlier. Any transfer, sale, refinancing, or change in ownership required my direct written authorization and independent legal review. My heart began to beat faster. "So they cannot transfer anything?" I asked. Richard shook his head. "Not without you." Relief washed over me, but it lasted only a moment. "Then why would they act as though everything already belongs to them?" Richard leaned back in his chair. "That is the question that concerns me." He opened another section of the file. There is more. Several documents contained notes from meetings he had held with Harold during the final years of his life. Harold had asked detailed questions about protecting assets. Protecting the home. Protecting me. Richard tapped one note with his finger. This meeting took place about 18 months before Harold passed away. I read the handwritten summary. Harold had expressed concern that family pressure could one day be applied after his death. No names were mentioned. No accusations. Just concern. A quiet precaution from a man who rarely acted without reason. I stared at the page. "Did he tell you why he was worried?" Richard was silent for several seconds. He said something that stayed with me. My eyes lifted. "What?" Richard folded his hands. "He told me that sometimes people reveal their intentions when they think nobody is listening." The words settled heavily in the room. I immediately remembered dozens of moments. Vanessa asking questions about property values. Ethan discussing home equity. Casual conversations that seemed harmless at the time. Richard continued. "I do not know what Harold saw or heard. He never provided specifics. But he was concerned enough to strengthen every legal protection available." I looked down at the documents again. For the first time since arriving home, I felt something other than confusion. I felt prepared. Not because the situation was solved. It was not. But because I finally knew Harold had left safeguards behind. He had anticipated possibilities I never considered. Richard closed the file. "There is another issue." My stomach tightened. "What issue?" He reached for a separate folder. 3 months ago, someone contacted my office requesting information regarding property administration. The room seemed to grow quieter. "Who?" Richard opened the folder and glanced at the record. "Your son." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I was surprised. Because hearing it confirmed something I had been trying not to believe. Richard continued carefully. "We declined to provide any confidential information. Everything was handled appropriately. But the inquiry happened." I stared out the window. Cars moved through the intersection below. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Ordinary lives. Ordinary days. Meanwhile, a secret had been unfolding around me for months. Maybe longer. Richard slid a business card across the desk. "My advice is simple. Do not confront anyone yet. Do not discuss these documents. Let them continue believing you know less than you actually do." I picked up the card and nodded slowly. For the first time since the moving truck appeared, I understood the value of silence. They believed I was displaced, confused, vulnerable. They believed the plan was working. As I gathered the copies and prepared to leave, my phone vibrated. A text message appeared on the screen. The sender's name made me pause. Linda Matthews, my next-door neighbor for nearly 20 years. The message contained only one sentence. "Margaret, there is something you need to know about what happened while you were away." I called Linda before I even reached the parking lot. She answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded nervous. "Margaret, where are you?" she asked. "Downtown. I just left Richard's office." A long pause followed. "Good," she said quietly. Do not go back to the house yet. Those words immediately caught my attention. Linda was not the type to exaggerate. During the 20 years we had lived next door to one another, she had always been practical, measured, and careful with her opinions. If she sounded worried, there was a reason. What happened? I asked. Can we meet somewhere? 30 minutes later we sat in a small coffee shop 3 blocks from my hotel. Linda wrapped both hands around a paper cup and looked toward the window before speaking. I have been trying to decide whether to tell you this for weeks. My stomach tightened. Weeks. Not days. Weeks. Tell me what? Linda lowered her voice. The moving trucks were not the first thing. I remained silent and let her continue. About 6 weeks ago, contractors started visiting the house. I frowned. Contractors? She nodded. Roofing companies. Interior designers. A landscaping crew. People were coming and going constantly. That made no sense. No renovation had ever been discussed with me. Linda continued. At first I assumed you knew about it. Then I realized something was strange because you were never there. She took a sip of coffee. One afternoon, I asked Vanessa whether you were traveling. She said you were considering a permanent move and wanted a fresh start. I stared at her. A permanent move. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Familiar. Exactly the kind of language Vanessa preferred. There is more, Linda said. My pulse quickened. Several times I overheard conversations in the driveway. Ethan and Vanessa kept talking about timelines. Timelines? Yes. They seemed worried about getting everything finished before you came back. The words settled heavily between us. Before I came back. Not after. Before. Which meant my return had always been part of their calculations. Linda reached into her purse and removed her phone. I debated showing you this. She opened a photograph and slid the phone across the table. The image had been taken from her front porch. My house stood in the background. Near the driveway, Ethan and Vanessa were speaking with 2 men wearing business suits. One carried a leather portfolio. Another held a clipboard. Who are they? I asked. I do not know, Linda admitted. But they were there twice. I enlarged the image. The photograph was not perfectly clear, but I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. One of the men was holding a sign. Real estate consultation. My chest tightened. Richard had already confirmed the house could not legally be transferred without me. Yet someone had clearly been exploring options. Linda watched my expression carefully. Margaret, I am sorry. I should have called sooner. I shook my head. You assumed I knew. At first, her eyes softened. But then I started noticing something else. What? Linda hesitated. Ethan did not seem happy. That surprised me. What do you mean? Several times I saw him sitting alone on the porch after everyone left, just staring into the yard. He looked exhausted. I remembered the look on his face when I arrived home. The dark circles, the tension, the avoidance. For the first time, I wondered whether Ethan had fully understood what was happening or whether he had simply been carried along by a plan that grew larger than expected. Linda reached across the table and gently touched my hand. Whatever this is, Margaret, it started long before your trip. I nodded slowly. Richard had uncovered legal preparations. Linda had uncovered physical preparations. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. Someone had spent months building a future that did not include me. The question was no longer whether there had been a plan. The question was how far that plan had gone. As we stood to leave, my phone vibrated again. A new message appeared from Ethan. Mom, Vanessa and I are hosting a small gathering at the house this Saturday. We would really like you to come. I read the message twice. Then I looked at Linda. Neither of us said a word. We both understood the same thing. Whatever they were planning next was about to happen on Saturday. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather. I spent most of the morning doing exactly what Richard suggested. Nothing. I did not call Ethan. I did not ask questions. I did not reveal what I had learned. By noon, I was standing across the street from the house that had once felt like the safest place in the world. Several cars lined the curb. Guests were arriving carrying gift bags and bottles of wine. Through the open front door, I could see decorations inside. Fresh flowers. New furniture. Even the walls looked different. The transformation was remarkable and unsettling. It was as though someone had tried to erase every trace of the life Harold and I built there. I remained in my car for a few minutes, watching people arrive. Some were neighbors. Others were friends of Ethan and Vanessa. None of them knew the full story. To them, this probably looked like a celebration. A young family beginning a new chapter. Eventually, I stepped out and walked toward the house. Conversations softened when guests noticed me. A few people smiled politely. Others looked uncomfortable. News travels quickly in suburban neighborhoods, but truth travels much slower. Ethan spotted me first. Relief flashed across his face. Genuine relief. "Mom, you came." I smiled softly. "You invited me." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more. Then, Vanessa appeared beside him. She wore a bright smile and immediately slipped her arm through his. "Margaret, we are so glad you could make it." Her voice was warm, almost too warm. I followed them inside. The living room was crowded with guests admiring the renovations. Several complimented the updated design. Others discussed future plans for the property. Future plans. I heard that phrase more than once. The longer I listened, the clearer everything became. People were speaking as though Ethan and Vanessa already owned the house. Not someday. Now. Someone had been telling a very specific version of events. I accepted a glass of iced tea and quietly observed. That afternoon taught me something important. When people believe they have won, they become careless. Near the fireplace, I overheard Vanessa speaking with a couple from the neighborhood. "It has been a long process," she said, "but everything is finally settled." The exact phrase from the letter on the front door. The exact phrase Ethan repeated when I arrived home. Hearing it again sent a chill through me. A little later, I noticed a framed rendering displayed on an easel near the dining room. Architectural plans. Expanded kitchen. New landscaping. Additional rooms. Significant renovations. Guests gathered around admiring the designs. One man asked when construction would begin. Vanessa smiled confidently. "As soon as the final paperwork is complete." Final paperwork. Richard's warning echoed in my mind. Across the room, Ethan appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Several times I caught him staring at the floor while Vanessa spoke. He laughed when expected, smiled when necessary, but there was tension in every movement. He looked like a man carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. As the afternoon progressed, Vanessa eventually tapped a spoon against a glass and called for everyone's attention. Conversations faded. Guests gathered in the living room. Ethan stood beside her. "Thank you all for coming," Vanessa began. "This house represents a wonderful new beginning for our family." Applause followed. She continued speaking about dreams, plans, and opportunities. Then she looked toward me. "And we are especially grateful that Margaret understands how important this transition is." Several guests turned to look at me. The room grew quiet. I set my glass down carefully and smiled. "I am glad everyone is enjoying the afternoon," I said. My voice remained calm, steady. In fact, I believe the most interesting part of this story is still ahead of us. For the briefest moment, confusion crossed Vanessa's face. Ethan looked at me sharply, and standing near the doorway, unnoticed by almost everyone else, I saw Richard Collins step inside carrying a leather briefcase. Every conversation in the room seemed to stop at once. Guests turned toward the doorway as Richard stepped inside, carrying his briefcase. Vanessa's confident smile faltered for the first time all afternoon. Ethan looked from me to Richard and then back again, as though he suddenly realized there were pieces of the story he had never been shown. Richard walked calmly across the room and stopped beside me. "Good afternoon," he said politely. I apologized for interrupting. No one responded immediately. The silence felt heavy. Vanessa recovered first. "Richard, what a surprise." Her voice sounded pleasant, but there was tension beneath it. Richard nodded. I was invited. Several guests exchanged curious glances. I watched Vanessa carefully. She was trying to assess the situation, trying to understand how much I knew. Richard opened his briefcase and removed a folder. "Since future plans have already been discussed publicly today," he said, "it seems appropriate to clarify a few facts." Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. Vanessa folded her arms. "I'm not sure this is necessary." Richard smiled politely. "Legally speaking, it is." The room grew even quieter. He opened the folder and began speaking in the calm, measured tone attorneys often use. There was no drama in his voice, no anger, only facts. He explained that Harold had established extensive protections for the property years before his death. He explained that ownership had been secured through legal structures specifically designed to prevent unauthorized transfers. He explained that no sale, renovation agreement, refinancing arrangement, or ownership change could occur without my direct approval and independent legal review. Several guests looked surprised. One man glanced toward the architectural drawings near the dining room. Another quietly set down his drink. Vanessa's expression hardened. There must be some misunderstanding, she said. Richard calmly produced additional documents. There is no misunderstanding. Then he revealed something I had not even known myself until earlier that week. Harold had left a personal letter attached to the estate documents. Not a legal instruction. A letter. Richard unfolded a copy and began reading. Harold's words filled the room. He wrote about family, about responsibility, about protecting the people he loved. Most of all, he wrote about me. He explained that the house was not simply property. It was a home built through decades of sacrifice, work, and shared memories. He wrote that no one should ever pressure me into surrendering it. By the time Richard finished reading, several people had tears in their eyes. I felt my own throat tighten. It was the first time I had heard those words. Even after 3 years, Harold had somehow managed to protect me one final time. I looked toward Ethan. His face had gone pale. He was staring at the floor. "Mom," he whispered. I could see the realization settling over him. Whatever version of events he had accepted, it was finally colliding with reality. Vanessa attempted one final objection, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The room had already shifted. Guests were no longer admiring future plans. They were questioning how those plans had been presented in the first place. Richard closed the folder. "The legal position is very clear," he said. "Margaret remains fully protected, and all decisions regarding the property remain hers alone. No threats, no arguments, just the truth. Sometimes the truth is enough." The gathering ended soon afterward. People left quietly. Conversations became subdued. The architectural drawings disappeared from the easel. By sunset, only a handful of cars remained outside. Ethan eventually approached me alone on the back porch. The same porch where Harold and I had spent countless evenings together. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I am sorry, Mom." I believed he meant it. Not because apologies erase consequences. They do not. But because for the first time in a very long while, he seemed honest. We talked until the sun disappeared behind the trees. Not about ownership. Not about legal documents. About choices. About trust. About the things that matter long before money enters the conversation. Weeks later, I moved back into the house. The roses were replanted. Family photographs returned to their shelves. Life did not magically become perfect. Real life never does. But something important had changed. I stopped mistaking silence for peace. I stopped assuming good intentions without evidence. Most importantly, I learned that protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is necessary. Harold understood that long before I did. And every morning when I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight touch the garden he planted, I remember his final gift. He did not leave me a house. He left me the truth. And in the end, that was worth far more.